even as Japanese troops marched ever deeper into China, the Army planned for the day it could move against the Soviets and take oil-rich Siberia. To test the strength of the Russians, the Japanese instigated 2 border clashes with them. In the second incident, Japan lost 40,000 men in just a few months of fighting.
In 1939, there's a relatively obscure but somewhat historically significant clash between Soviet and Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol, near the Manchurian frontier. It's a small border clash, ostensibly, but it probably alerted the Japanese to the fact that fighting the Russians would be a tough go, and helped divert their strategic thinking to the south, towards Indonesia and other places that were resource-rich and probably a good deal easier to conquer.
The Dutch East Indies possessed all the oil the Japanese needed, but Japan knew that if it took these oil fields, the Dutch would surely be supported by Great Britain and the United States. So the Japanese bided their time, working to win the war in China while waiting for a more favorable world situation. Events in Europe soon gave the Japanese the opening they needed. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, plunging Europe into the nightmare of the Second World War. 2 days after the attack, France and Britain declared war on Hitler's Germany, but their entry into the war did little to help Poland. In under a month, Poland fell to the German onslaught, while its so-called allies sat behind the Maginot Line in France and did nothing. The following spring, Germany unleashed its Wehrmacht on Western Europe. The Danes, Dutch, Belgians all succumbed in a matter of days. The French were next. The Germans flanked the Maginot Line and with its tanks supported by dive bombers crushed the Allied armies. The beleaguered remnants of the British Expeditionary Force abandoned the continent at Dunkirk, leaving behind their equipment, tanks, and artillery. The French fought on alone for a few more weeks, but the struggle proved hopeless. At the end of June, France stunned the world and surrendered. Finally, the chance the Japanese had been waiting for had arrived. With the French defeated, the British fighting for their very existence, and the Netherlands under the Nazi jackboot, their Asian colonies were ripe for the taking. The Japanese moved quickly. In the summer of 1940, Japan forced the Vichy French government to allow imperial troops to occupy the northern half of French Indochina. This was done to stop the flow of Western supplies to Chiang Kai-shek. Next, Tokyo pressured Great Britain to close the Burma Road, the only other avenue for supplies to reach the nationalist Chinese. Isolated, China fought on, refusing Japan's calls for surrender. In September of 1940, Yosuke Matsuoka, now the Tokyo government's foreign minister, traveled to Europe to sign the Tri-Partie Pact, a full military alliance with Italy and Germany. A short time later, he signed a non-aggression treaty with Stalin, guaranteeing the safety of Japan's northern flank on the Asian mainland. The Japanese now had a free hand to move south. In response to Japan's new alliance and developments in Europe, President Roosevelt declared a limited state of national emergency. A peacetime draft, the first in American history, was pushed through Congress.
We must and we will marshal our great potential strength to fend off war from our shores. The first number drawn by the Secretary of War is serial number 158.
15 million men don uniforms as America takes its first reluctant strides toward preparing for war. Short of every modern implement of war, the Army could only train its new recruits with stovepipe mortars with beer cans for ammunition and wooden machine guns. Without tanks, trucks took their place in the makeshift maneuvers designed to teach the swelling officer corps how to fight. America awoke from its dream of isolation to face a hostile world for which it was not prepared. Worse, some in the United States refused to recognize the threat. While Asia smoldered and Europe burned, America argued. Isolation or intervention? The question divided the country and set the stage for bitter debates that spread from the halls of Congress to the streets of every American city. The America First Committee led the opposition to Roosevelt's plan of assistance to Britain and China. With Charles Lindbergh as its chief spokesman, the group garnered considerable support.
France has now been defeated, and despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war. I believe and I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send.
Not every American saw Germany as the chief threat anyway. Throughout the United States, the German-American Bund held rallies to drum up support for Hitler and push America away from alliance with Great Britain.
Jewish Moscow directed domination.
But Nazi thugs gained only a slight foothold on this side of the Atlantic as newsreels and newspapers revealed them to be little more than riffraff.
If you elect me President of the United States, I shall never send an American boy to fight in any European war.
1940 was presidential election year in the United States, and Roosevelt's main concern that summer was to get himself reelected.
I place in nomination that valiant American, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
I consider it a public duty to answer falsifications with facts. I will not pretend that I find this an unpleasant duty. I am an old campaigner, and I love a good fight.
Roosevelt got his good fight, though like his opponent, Wendell Willkie, he promised not to send American boys to fight in foreign wars. November the 5th was presidential election day, and by midnight, America's choice of president for another 4 years was clear.
The results are now conclusive. Roosevelt wins.
FDR's re-election indicated the majority of Americans favored the route he charted, a route that offered aid to the Allies while promising to avoid war. In early 1941, the Lend-Lease Act passed through Congress, giving Britain access to thousands of tons of war material produced in American factories.
People of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and our security. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
President Roosevelt believed so strongly in the Lend-Lease policy that he literally took modern weapons out of the hands of American soldiers who desperately needed to train with them and sent them to Britain, under the understanding that, viewed in a larger perspective, the British needed them worse than we did.
And while the United States struggled to support its foreign allies, Japan mobilized for war. The entire civilian population was prepared for any eventuality, including attack from the air. Almost daily, students at high schools and universities conducted military training under the supervision of Army instructors. An entire generation of young men learned that dying for the emperor was the most noble ideal. Each month, thousands of men were drafted to feed the never-ending war of attrition in China. Fewer and fewer would return home safely. And by 1941, over 100,000 Japanese had been killed in action. As the Army fought its war in China, the Navy readied for its role in the coming invasion to the south. The sailors were pushed to their limits, and the Imperial Navy grew lean and hard. When war would come, the Japanese fleet would be prepared for it, and sailors of the Allied nations would suffer terribly at its hands. Peace in the Pacific would soon become a distant memory as Japan unleashed its awesome war machine on its unsuspecting adversaries.